Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks again for joining the VIP lunch here. My name is Stephen Earn, Senior Director at SLK Software. Greatly appreciate your participation today. We've got two pretty incredible people in front of us today, both incredibly modest. So I'm going to give a little bit of introduction for them on their behalf. So first, we've got Nick with us today. He's I guess I would say a technology visionary and global business leader. He led IBM for, I think, more than 4 decades. A huge stalwart in the technology, intelligence, education community, sitting on boards such as Bank of New York, Mellon, AMD, Liberty Mutual. So please welcome Nick Donofrio. Hi, Nick.
Hello, everyone.
With a great match, we've got also very honored to have Jane Possell with us today. Seasoned insurance leader, 2 decades in the industry, former managing director at Accenture. Jane now heads the seat of CIO at CNA Insurance. So please, again, welcome Jane Possell from CNA in Chicago.
Thank you, Stephen.
So just a couple of housekeeping items here. We've got some key questions. You've got some note cards and pens. Unfortunately, with the venue, we don't have too much interaction. But if you have a question that you would really like to ask to Nick or Jane, write it down. We'll have someone collect it, and we'll certainly do our best to make sure we get that answered, a question answered. So we're gonna dive right into it. So our first question is really for both Jane and Nick. I'm going to let Jane dive into this one first. So Jane, we hear so much about AI, and so I'm curious to understand why now? What's so burgeoning around AI? What's helping the adoption from your perspective?
It's a great question. There's actually so many things that I think are contributing to the why now. But one of the biggest ones, especially somebody who spends a lot of time in the technology enablement end of this conversation, is around cloud. I remember even 5 years ago when I was with Liberty Mutual and we would be working on trying to do model development, and just to get the bricks of data that were necessary as input, even begin working on algorithms, much less trying to do training of a model, it would take us weeks. And frankly, it was lots of hardware provisioning. There was a lot of machination behind it. And I think as companies have really gotten over that initial cloud learning hurdle, if you will, right? The difference in 5 years ago, a lot of companies were working with cloud, but it was in kind of a corner of the organization somewhere. Certainly some were much further ahead. But now I think the majority of companies, especially at scale, are really have a cloud position that allows them to actually be a lot more creative and a lot more flexible with what they're doing with data. How do I accumulate it, make it available? How do I spin up and down environment? And that, because at the end of the day, data really fuels AI at the end of the day. So I think that's a huge contributor to the why now.
Thanks, Jane. That makes a lot of sense. Nick, I'm going to throw the same question to you. Why now?
Sure. So I'm probably the oldest person in the room, and you'll have to kind of bear with me because I actually remember AI when it started about 50 years ago. So when you ask the question, why now? It's not because we didn't know what to do. It's not because we didn't understand it. It's not because we just created it, and people need to kind of remember that. It's more what James said. It's because the technology is now available to actually do it in more of a wholesale fashion. So it's more democratized. People have been doing AI stuff forever. You need to remember that because they could afford it. But now we have democratized this technology to the point where almost everyone can afford it and needs to afford it and needs to think about the consequences of it and also the consequences of not doing it, because there's a ditch on both sides of the road. So my net, Stephen and Jane, would be technology finally caught up with us, and it does that always, right? I mean, if you look through our history files, especially in IT, good ideas are always there. They're just not implementable because the technology isn't there to enable them. But that's where we are now, and that's why it's happening now. And more about data as we go along, because Jane nailed it. Data is the issue.
So I tell you what, while we're sorting that out, Jane, we're going to pivot a little bit to another question to you, right? So, I know that you're driving AI within your organization, and I think number one is like, how is that happening for you? And also, like, what expectations are you setting for your business leaders, right, around AI? If you can expand upon that a little bit, that would be great.
Sure. So, this is not one of those things that you say, I mean, like Nick said, it's not brand new. It's nothing that is, nothing anyone's ever not heard of before, that business leaders haven't thought of before. What we're finding is, though, we really have to spend some time on art of the possible, but with a use case that resonates. Right? Because I think art of the possible is very easy. So, CNA is a commercial insurance carrier. In other words, we don't sell to people, we sell to businesses. And so a lot of the early AI use cases in insurance were all around personal lines. And it's very easy for one of our business leaders to say, well, that's fascinating, but that's not my business, right? I don't sell that way. So for example, we have a fantastic new chief data and analytics officer, and he comes from a background in credit cards, which is great because that's all about lots of data at scale around a very large group of people. And so he brings that kind of insight in. And what we've had to learn is if we want to share art of the possible around models, we can't take something that requires that much data about individual people and say, see what we could do. Because if you're leading commercial insurance or you run our field organization who are busy selling into brokers, as an example, it just doesn't resonate. So we've had to really figure out what are the use cases that are going to resonate? What are some problems that fundamentally our business leaders spend a lot of time on? They've got a lot of analysts. They go back and forth a lot. And how do we take that problem and then show art of the possible and work on it? And from what you asked about the expectations we're setting with the business, one of the things that we've had to set is helping them understand that great AI has a very iterative nature to it, very iterative. And sometimes that's hard, especially if, you're talking to the CIO, you're used to your CIO saying, no, we're going to start here and we're going to end here, and this is what you're going to get at the end of it, right? Very waterfall kind of mentality. And so the business leaders aren't used to, hey, here's what we're going to start with, because they'll look at the first thing that comes out of the models and say, well, this part doesn't look right, and I have all these questions. Like, great, that's what we want to have happen, right? So just helping them understand, what does it look like? What does it sound like? Makes a huge difference, because those now that are ahead of that curve inside CNA, they all look at the first, the first turn of a model and say, wow, that's really interesting. Wouldn't it be great if, which is exactly the conversation that we want to be having. So that's some of what we're doing to try to move that conversation forward inside CNA.
Nice, Jane. Thanks. That's pretty insightful. So, Jane, I think you've got an interesting question for Nick about the hype. So I'm gonna turn the moderating over to you.
No, thank you. Yeah, Nick, I'm really interested. I mean, as you said, right, AI has been around for a very long time. So, I mean, what's true AI and what's not true AI? And how do we separate the hype from the reality?
Yeah, I mean, you're probably the better expert, Jane.
I think you're on mute. Oh, there we go. Now we got you.
Can you hear me now?
Nope, go ahead.
Yeah. Terrific. Thank you.
Gotcha.
So just put your hand up if you can't hear me anymore. But Jane, I loved what you said in the beginning here, and you are clearly on the right path with the word iterative. But look, I think the issue that you need to most often worry about here is the data. Of course, you're business minded, so you start with the problem, and that's always the right thing to do. Remember, all we're doing is writing algorithms here with AI that map up against that problem to try to predict behavior, anticipate behavior, and give ourselves an advantage, as a result of understanding that behavior. But the data is what matters, Jane. And I don't think people understand enough about the various forms of data. that could be theirs. Somebody could be selling you data. You have to worry about the provenance of the data that you're receiving. It comes with bias. You have no idea of how bad things could be if you don't understand where that data came from, how it got there, and the provenance of it, because you're going to own the results. There's a lot of stuff out there that I call synthetic data. It's data that's actually been produced to give you the desired result. And if you're not aware of the fact that there is such a thing as synthetic data, I mean, you could slowly be bending yourself in the wrong direction, and years from now, serious adverse consequences to be paid. So, Jane, it's data. I love you starting with the problem. I like your iterative nature, but that data is what you're iterating on, and you've got to make sure that data is real.
That's so true. That's so true. And one of the things, Nick, I think you might have seen too is sometimes the data is real, but nobody knows what it actually is. So it turns out because of limitations about storage and other things, we recombine data together in ways that only certain humans inside the company understand how that got recombined. Now, data lakes are offering an opportunity to unwind that. But that's the other thing I've seen is that sometimes companies make the mistake of not understanding that you're starting AI on top of interpreted data. It's a little bit like what you were talking about around fabricated data, right?
Yep. Well, it's all true, Jane. So, I mean, you can't say enough about the fact that the success or failure of these AI projects hinges not so much on the algorithm you wrote, but really the data you used, how you curated it, what you did with it. And I hear you, with the high druids in some companies, the only people who can touch the data are these specially anointed ones because they're the ones who know how the data came together and why it formed the way it formed. Those are the things that have to become a little more democratized. They have to become a little more transparent. They have to become a little more open. And then there will be even more uptake, I think, on the AI side. Again, it's not because we don't know what the problems are, or it's not because we can't write the algorithms. We can do all those things. It's the data source. It's always back to, what is it? It's the data, stupid. I mean, just focus on the data and all else comes to pass the way you want it to come to pass. So I can't emphasize enough. You can't invest enough in understanding clean data and the source of the data, the provenance of the data, and the history files are so important. And be aware of the fact that there are people out there who are trying to get you in a biased position to somewhere else. So, I mean, bad things happen, cyber security issues happen. Trust me, the same thing is going to happen to data. There's going to be data corruptors out there. There are going to be people who try to find their way in life, selling you data that you think does what you want, but actually does what they want.
No, it's a great point, Nick. Stephen, if you don't mind, I have another question for Nick, actually. Nick, what are organizations forfeiting by not approaching AI the right way? So you just shared a couple of great examples of some pitfalls. So what do you think organizations are forfeiting by not approaching AI in the right way? And the other kind of tangential question is, obviously you've seen the role of IT from sort of the day the mainframes were adopted to all the way to now. And you gave some great advice, but what additional advice would you give to leaders?
Yeah. So Jane, great questions. I think what you potentially forfeit, is your right to credibility. You put in a bad AI program, you start to conclude the wrong results. It's your reputation that's on the line. And you have to kind of remind yourself that the consumers, the users, the clients, the people at the end, they're becoming as smart as you are. And they're becoming very sophisticated in what they see or how they see or what happens to them and why it happens to them. I mean, it might be hard for you to believe at 76 that I can still learn, but I actually am still learning, right? I mean, I see the patterns on my iPhone. I see the patterns, in my computer. And I start to say, that's what they're doing with all this data. they're approaching me this way or they're approaching me that way. So the bad deal here, or the adverse consequence, Jane, is your reputation, because people are just going to walk away from you. You're going to become, don't think you're the only smart person here. I mean, that would be my advice to you as a business. Don't think that you're the only smart person, that no one's going to figure out you're doing this. So whatever you do and whatever you interact and whatever you present yourself back to your client base or your customer base, it better be on a solid footing, Jane, because they're going to figure it out and they're going to find somebody else to become their service provider or to become their bank or their insurance company. So that's my biggest worry, Jane. In terms of the changes, I mean, honestly, as a leader, and you know this yourself, you have to be prepared for everything. You should never assume that it won't happen, because it will. Anything is possible and everything is likely, is the way you should be thinking. Technology is gone. I mean, if you think it's moved a lot, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 orders of magnitude, it's probably got another 8 or 9 orders of magnitude to go in the next 20 or 30 years. So we're nowhere near the end of anything, Jay. We're really at the beginning of everything. So if you're not, as a leader, prepared for change, if change isn't your middle name, I think you're in the wrong place. You're in the wrong job, and you better start thinking about, a new career path, because it's just beginning, Jane. As exciting as my life has been, back from the mainframe vacuum tube days, which I don't think anybody in the room knows what a vacuum tube is but me, to where we are today, it's nothing, Jane. As exciting as my life has been, it's nothing compared to what you're going to see going forward. Thank you.
No, that's great. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we see examples of that, as well, where we've had things that have been brought forward to us by a partner using AI, and you're absolutely right. You do see the patterns. And so it is the reputation. I think that's a great point. It's a really great point.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you.
So Jane, I know that we have you until the top of the hour. I'm going to let you depart us. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Very insightful. And thank you again, and have a good afternoon, okay?
Jane, you're wonderful.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you very much. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
We'll be in touch.
Enjoy the rest of the session. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Jane. So, Nick, I have an interesting question for you. I know that you knew Steve Jobs pretty well, as I understand it. So I'm curious to know, like, what would his perspective be of where we are and what that future might look like? I think that's we'd love to hear about that.
That's very interesting. Yeah, Steve and I did know each other very well. Not personal friends, but very strong business colleagues. And I'm clearly saddened by the fact that he's not with us. So I knew Steve when he was in Apple, then out of Apple. He was in Next, and then he went back to Apple. And his approach to things, to be honest with you, Steve, is it's not ready until I say it's ready. And that was kind of his mantra. It was, I'm looking for the problem that we're solving. And until I can wrap my head around that problem, I don't really care what everybody else is doing. I don't care what technology is doing. I need to understand the problem, and I'm going to start with the problem and going to work my way back. That's why he's one of the best innovators I've ever met, is because, he was clearly very proud of himself. He was clearly, self-assured in everything he said. And most of you remember, Apple wasn't necessarily the first to the market, but when he went to the market in a very positive way, and it was very well done. So with respect to AI, I think Steve would have said, just like I tried to say to you earlier on, hey, it wasn't ready. It wasn't ready 50 years ago. It wasn't ready 40 years ago. It wasn't ready 30 years ago. It wasn't ready 10. Now it might be ready, because technology has clearly come to pass. I think he would have welcomed it, because I think, he's always trying to anticipate what your problem was, what was wrong, what needed to be done, how could life be better for you? And that's the Steve Jobs I got to know. So I believe he would have thought very highly of AI in the sense that he could have figured out how to put it to work to make your life even better than it is. And along the way, he add to his own success, which was always on Steve's mind. So, I mean, I think what Jane and I kind of said would have fit well with Steve. And, he would have been quick to point out, of course, all the reasons why doing it his way would have been the better way. But you would have expected that, from Steve.
Sure.
Does that help you, Stephen?
Absolutely, thank you. And now, what I would say is, like, in the world of AI and quantum technology, where do you think we'll be in 10 years? What's your perspective on the next, 10 years or beyond, for that matter?
Well, first, I hope I'm around. Secondly,
We do too. Go ahead.
yeah, thank you. That was meant to be a joke, by the way. So, look, I think, as I said when Jane was with us, you have seen nothing yet. You have seen absolutely nothing in terms of the excitement associated with technology. One of the things you should all be focused on, and you should all develop your own point of view on, is what happens post-silicon. The silicon world, the way we know it today, all the chips that we have, all the enablement that they've done, that's going to change, my friends. It's running out of space. Silicon, the way you know it, is running out of space. Now, as I said earlier, I'm old enough to have seen other changes, right? I came from the vacuum tube era. I came from the single transistor era into the LSI, large scale integration era. So I've watched technology change. I've watched us move from one semiconductor technology to another to another. So, most of you haven't seen that. Most of you, your entire life has been one basic technology. Give me another chip. Give me a chip that's faster. Give me a chip that's bigger. Give me a chip that's cheaper. Give me a chip that's cooler. That is coming to an end. There'll be other things. There'll be other ways. Watch that. If you're looking to be a leader here, you should start to develop your own point of view about what is the post-silicon world look like. And I'm going to say something to you that you might be offended by, and it's not going to be quantum computing. I mean, quantum computing is important, but it does not solve all the problems that we need to solve. It only solves a certain class of problems, and it does it incredibly well. I mean, a lot of those problems have to do with national defense because the whole world of encrypted data can be cracked by a solid quantum computing system. And they can break those algorithms faster than you can wink or blink. So there's incentive to continue to move forward. And you could apply those into the financial services markets, and you will. And the government will tell you whether you can or not. And the government will argue with you about what does or doesn't make sense. They usually do that, by the way, in my mind, given my experience at the bank and at the Liberty, they do that when they're confused, right? So you got to educate them. You got to help them understand the goodness associated with these technologies, and not let them outlaw them or not let them try to regulate them. And I've had many discussions with the Federal Reserve on this topic. So I think the possibilities are incredible. The technology mix will be different. There is a post-silicon world. I don't know, I'm not going to tell you I know what it is, but I am suggesting that each of you develop your own point of view about it. Go read about it. Go understand what's happening, where things are going. You see how vital this whole thing is. You can't buy a car right now. Cars, of all things, are being stopped. These mechanical wonders are being stopped because they can't have a chip put in them. And that's going to be around for a while, my friends, unfortunately. And by the way, there's more and more technology going into those cars. I mean, so it's not the end of this issue, it's the beginning of this issue. And you should think about that. Where is that capacity? What is that capacity? And, how secure is it? If you were an automaker right now, that's what you'd be focused on. How did we get here? You know, how for the lack of a $3 chip does a $60,000 car not ship? That's how dependent we are on technology. And that's going to increase over time. And you as IT professionals, you as financial services professionals, you need to always worry about where are we getting our stuff from? And how is that stuff coming to us? And how secure is that stuff going to be? And are we going to be at that break point, such as the auto industry is right now? Sorry, Steve, I got a little wound up on that. So if you want to bring me back to ground, by all means do that.
So Nick, that leads to an interesting question. You mentioned something about, the outlaw, if you will, of AI technologies and these types of technologies. Help us understand why we shouldn't fear AI. There's notions that it's going to, take over something or become beyond our control, sort of thing. If you don't mind speaking to that, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the first lecture I gave on AI, to be candid with you. It was back, remember the moonwalk? Does anybody remember that besides me? I think that was like in the early 1980s. I had to speak to a high school graduating class, and they didn't want to listen to me until I could do the moonwalk. So I had to make a fool of myself on stage doing the moonwalk, and then tell them about AI way back then. And I said to them, look, this is nothing to fear. I mean, they were all worried about it, like, well, what's going to happen in 1980? Like, what, do I even bother going to college? I mean, is it all over for me? No. Look, always remember, we are creating this, me and you, and people just like me and you, right? I'm not a singularity person. I should have said that to you up front. If you understand the theory of singularity, I don't believe in it. I think we're the smarter critters on this earth, and we always will be. And I don't think we're ever will build a computer that will be smarter than you and me. We won't. I mean, they can beat us in one thing or another, but they don't think like you and I, right? And that's what you have to remember. We did this. We did AI. We created this. We're in control of it, and therefore don't fear it. But likewise, don't trivialize it. Don't go to sleep at the switch here. I mean, it has intended consequences that are good, but it has unintended consequences that could be used for bad. And that's what you need to constantly push yourself on. What are those unintended consequences? What are the things that we don't see that we could get in trouble for? Just like with cyber, there's nothing wrong with being cyber experts, nothing wrong with being connected, but there's always bad people out there that figure out how to put technology to work to do bad things. They're called crooks. And you know why they're crooks? They're crooks because they're lazy, and they always take the low road out, the easiest path out. Those are the things you have to worry about. Not the technology itself taking over and us being, slaves, to a computer somewhere in the sky. That's absurd. That's just not going to happen. I've often said when we're talking to groups like this, if you really want to know about the future, I mean, I've given you my view. Read a lot more science fiction. They tend to write better things about the future than technologists. We're kind of strapped to a certain, thinking. We're kind of bound by a knowledge base and a history file. You want a better view of the future, then go find a good, science fiction writer and read what they've got to say, because they're probably more right, in some sense than someone like me. But on this point, does AI take over? Is AI something to be? It is something to be worried about. It's not anything to be trifled with, but it is not the end. It doesn't get out of control unless you and I make it, unless you and I create it that way. And then there will always be one of us who can control it.
Thank you. So Nick, I see some pretty engaged faces, to be quite honest. And we have a few minutes left. Do you mind if I allow a couple of folks to ask a question?
By all means.
I'm going to put somebody on the spot. Anybody have a question for Nick by chance? It's okay if you don't. I know there's a lot happening. I don't know if you heard that, Nick, but someone just said you're too smart to ask a question to. So,
Oh, no. You've got the wrong guy. No, you've got the wrong person. Believe me. No, but ask whatever your questions
yes,
are.
we had a question. You may want to come a little bit to the front, just in case. Yeah, I mean, it's okay. We're going to ask you to introduce yourself. Tell us a little icebreaker.
Better.
Yeah, that's fine.
Now I'm getting and wanting to ask questions. Hey, sorry, Nick, I'm SVP Data Analytics, so all data.
All right. You got a data guy here, Nick.
One of the challenges that we've had, more less about the future, more about today, right? Is the acceptability of AI in regular today's practices, because it's kind of unexplainable, right? Kind of explaining to a business analyst or a business owner the outcomes of why machine learning or neural network algorithm is what it's saying it is, without them having to use their regular decision tree process to get to the same answer. How would you think about bridging that gap of being able to a traditional decision making process of how people go about doing the process of the problem today?
So I think if I understood the question correctly, you're kind of saying, how do you explain to people, especially regulators, why using AI is an okay thing to do, and why it shouldn't be regulated and why it shouldn't be outlawed.
Well, not necessarily. How do you explain it to them? Because traditional thinking and machines kind of are different, right?
Okay. So look,
Yeah.
I think you explain it to them in simple terms. You and I could sit down and observe everything. We have the ability to observe every transaction, and we would form our judgment and our actions based observations. We'd make things better. We'd watch people coming into banks. We'd watch what they do. We'd watch the way people approach insurance companies. We'd learn from that, and we would tailor our next actions, based on that learning. So all we're doing is using technology to enhance that ability to observe, understand what people do, and to actually make a better experience for them. So it's less about us lying, cheating, and stealing. That's not what we're doing. Some people will. That's what you need to be mindful of, and you need to figure out how to govern them. But what we're trying to do is to make our business better. We're trying to deliver our business faster, better, cheaper, and we're trying to build up a loyalty base. But we're trying to give people, and this is, by the way, what Steve Jobs would have done. We're trying to give you an experience that only we can give you, a better, holistic experience dealing with me. That's why we should be allowed to do this. That's why it's better, because it's more productive. We waste less time. We're doing things that are more likely to become the preferred choice. That help you?
Yes, thank you.
I think we have another question also. Thank you, Nick. We have another question. Just you can come right forward as if you're approaching the screen. It's fine.
Hi, how are you doing? So my name is Alan Hooney from Robots and Pencils, Growth and Innovation. Closer?
Yeah, please.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Thank you. Yep.
So I'm from Robots and Pencils, a company that, at its inception, believes that you solve the world's critical problems through sciences and humanities combined, right? The question I have is regarding bias in AI. And we heard earlier, maybe in the year, about the incident at Google where one of their lead developers or AI experts left because of that question, right? So how do you, what do you think if, like you said, AI is not a threat because of our human input? The other side of that equation is that human input can be biased, right? And could lead to different forms of discrimination or other forms of issues that can affect real human activity. So I want to just hear a bit more about that from you.
Sure. Thank you. And I think that is, thank you very much for what you do as well. I don't know your company, but it sounds like I should. So look, I personally believe that is the biggest issue that we're all facing here, is I can't emphasize enough this provenance of the data. I know it sounds trite, and I know you've been bombarded with data of all forms and velocities and varieties and all the rest of that stuff, but the veracity of the data is where it is. So if you wanted to do something clever, you would write AI algorithms to check the data. You would actually run a whole series of checks to find out what the bias is, in the data, and if there is a bias. Now, that's something only a few people can do. But, I think the open community is a place where you ought to go. I think you ought to push for more open standards. I think you ought to get behind the open movement. I found the power of collaborative open thinking to be helpful. There probably are organizations that exist. I'm not an expert in this area, but if there aren't, then maybe you should create an organization to exist, to kind of do that provenance for you, to do the data sorting, to check for the synthetic data, to check for the bias. I mean, look at how well we have done with something like FIDO. Another international standard, right? Fast internet, real-time, authentication. That's an open organization. The formula for success is clear. It's there for everyone to participate in, and the bad people can participate too. But once you get the world, the open community, working on fixing issues like passwords or hacking or the ability to compromise your system like Fido does, you could do the same thing with data. And you should be thinking this way. You should be saying, where is that organization for financial services? Where is it? Do we have one? Should we start one? Should we engage, with the open community? There are other open communities out there with respect to data. Should we engage with them? Should you and your organization, kind of, become a spearhead, for this effort? But you're not going to solve it alone. And the secrets to success are probably not worth keeping to yourself. That this is intellectual property that you're probably better off sharing with the world. I hope that answers, at least in part, your question. Thank you.
Fantastic. Any other questions for Nick before we start? Yeah, we got another question, Nick.
Sure.
Hello.
Hi, Nick. Steve Bishop. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Old Missouri Bank. I'm just curious, given your background and the change that you've seen, as this rolls out, are there things that have helped you from a leadership to make sure that it's being adopted both by your employees, by your customers, things that you should kind of signal, what is how you measure that success and things you should be aware of?
Thank you, Steve, for the question, and I wish you well, continued success in your business. And, Steve, I'm not going to try to be self-serving here, but I am just wrapping up my book right now, which has a lot of stuff in it. So when my book finally publishes, hopefully in the next several weeks, we'll let you know. But here's the shorthand, Steve. When you're leading large organizations, you have to lead not from a position of power, but you have to lead from a position of collaboration, of support. You have to lead from a position of enablement, Steve. That's the operative word. You have to enable them to become successful. You have to enable them to be able to do what they need to do. You have to build that in an environment, Steve, that is open, collaborative, transparent, multidisciplined, but most importantly, is risk focused. You want risks to be elevated, Steve. You don't want them to be lowered. You want to tell people, please be forthright with me. Tell me the truth. Be forthright. And I, as your leader, will be forthcoming. I will come to help you. And if forthright and forthcoming aren't the right words, pick them yourself. But that worked for me, Steve. In IBM, 250,000 technical people, not all of them reported to me solid line, but boy, did we ever have a relationship. Did we ever build an environment that was both forthright and forthcoming. Don't let people think that they got to press everything down, and that the lowest common denominator is the thing that gets cut out or fired, and therefore they never want to be that lowest common denominator. You need to know that, Steve, or else anything you do as a technical leader is going to fall apart. Hope that helps you.
Thank you.
Right, thanks, Nick. Any other questions? Oh, we have another question.
Sure.
Hi there, Nick. Ross Pringle from Citizens Bank. Very interested in the data piece of it and wondering if there is any types of data that is, more able to be leveraged. You see more opportunity in the current technology, capability that could be, leveraged. And then on the flip side, the types of data that might be more susceptible to bias and manipulation by these bad actors that you're talking about.
Sure. So, look, sadly, and this won't be good news to your ears, you can corrupt any form of data. So it's not necessarily the form or the source. I think the better you're better served when you pick open data, when the standards that the data was put together with are understandable, they're not baroque, they're not as Jane said, they're not the druids. The only people who know how the data came together are three people, and that's it inside the organization. So there are better data sources than others. The data types, the data structures, I don't think you should worry about that. I think you can actually find trouble in any data structure. But I think the people who give you the data, the people who collect the data, how they're collecting it, why they're collecting it, that's where you have to spend more of your effort. And that's why I said that open movement might be very worthwhile. If there could be, an industry focus, for instance, the financial services sector, or maybe it's the banking sector, or maybe it's the insurance sector, that's the gold standard, the platinum standard. So you go to them to get your data, and you convince yourself that they have all the provenance rules and regulations in place, to make sure that there's no bias. But if that, again, I said this earlier, I don't want you to necessarily always trust people either. Don't be afraid to write your own algorithms to check the data. Don't be afraid to look at the bias yourself. Don't be afraid to take a little time, effort, and resource, set it aside. I mean, maybe I'm also telling you to start another company for all I know. But I think you could do it yourself. I think with a little effort, you could actually put in place a group of people who could actually check the provenance of the data. I mean, they could certainly check a number of things. Maybe they can't find every bias, but you know how this works yourself. You get these strange emails, open them, don't open them. You look at them long enough and you figure out there's something wrong with it. That didn't make sense. There's a character over there that didn't work. They're not really who they said they are. That same kind of inquisitive mind works on the data source, right? I don't open emails that are strange, even if they come from the president of the United States or the president of the company or the CEO of the company. It's like, did she really send that to me? So you have to have that inquisitive mind. Yeah, I'm sure you have people in your organization that think that way. Encourage them. You may want to fund them, to do some of this kind of thinking. Again, I'm an engineer at heart, therefore I think like an engineer. But my best advice to you is always think about the problem in pieces. Break it into pieces that you can solve. And remember the pieces you broke it into, because you have to put it back together. You have to reintegrate it to get the total answer. But when you start out and you're not getting the answers that you're thinking that you should be getting, and when the answer doesn't look like it's right, better for you to go back to the beginning and check the assumptions. Always check the assumptions to make sure that they are right. Because when all else fails, chances are you made a bad choice. You made an assumption in the beginning that was wrong. If you think like that, if you just simply continue to go to root cause, continue to take things apart, continue to look at things, and encourage that in your organizations, encourage that kind of thinking, you're going to be better served. And I have to get this one last point in. The thing I worry the most about is that we forget what we're doing, that no one knows what we did and why we did it. You know, and in a quest to get things done faster, a lot of times that's what we do to each other. We don't care that you know anymore. We just want this result. We want you to move faster. We want you to be more iterative. You know, I'm not going to get a plug. I'm not putting a plug in for SLK Group here, but I actually know them well enough to know they know enough. They know enough of the details. And that's what you can't let happen to yourself. You can't abdicate the details. You can't simply say, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to let somebody else worry about that. And all of a sudden you wake up and you find out nobody knows how it works or why it works or where it came from. Do not let that happen to yourself. You will be responsible in the end. And no one's going to care, well, that's what best practices said. No one's going to care about best practices. Somebody's got to know the details. Somebody's got to understand it. And it's got to be you. And I'm going to leave it there, Stephen.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to wrap it up. Your timing and information was impeccable, Nick, and we all really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Pretty fascinating, and we appreciate it. Really do.
My pleasure. I wish you all continued success. Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you. Be safe, be well, and always be nice, my friends. Ciao, ciao. I'm going to hang up now, Stephen, okay?
You bet.
Thank you.
You bet.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.